Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Independent Socialists in Wellingborough Zoom meeting. Um, I'm delighted to welcome to the meeting Ross Bradshaw, who's, I think you're the owner, Ross, are you, or the proprietor, or the person who runs Five Leaf Bookshops in Nottingham. And Ross is going to talk to us this evening on Revolting Books is the title, Past, Present and Future, at the early political origins and major changes since addressing the counterculture, gay rights, gender, environment, and obviously other political issues. So basically, I suppose the alternative book distribution market, bookshops, and their contribution to the radical movements in Britain today. Would that be a fair reflection of what you're going to say
Um,
to us tonight? So welcome,
yes, I may
welcome,
not
Ross.
cover all of those points. I may cover some other points, but I'm happy to go ahead. Shall I just start?
Yes, please
So
kick
thank you
off. Please
for
kick off.
inviting me, and I'm very aware of Collett's in Wellingborough, and I will be referring to that later as a place where radical books, although Collett's Warehouse, Collett's Library Supply, wasn't necessarily the most radical uh, place in the UK. And I don't know if Collett's and Wellingborough had a strike, but certainly the Collett's workers in London struck at one stage. But we'll come back to that. So my name's Ross Bradshaw. I'm a long-time bookseller. Books has been my entire life, one way or another. And I thank my mother for that, and who was an ardent reader right to the very end of her life. And in fact, her last, if you like, public appearance was involved in a library campaign in the town that she lived in Hoyk, where the council was trying to reduce the library opening hours. And she was in the ranks of the several hundred people who turned up to oppose those cutbacks. And she was very proudly heckling the local councillors. So I started in bookselling at my college in Aberdeen, where I studied librarianship. And I had a socialist society bookstall. And that had a fairly mixed success, I have to say. And the only books I can remember from that time that I sold were a pamphlet on the St. Pancras rent strike of 1960 and the struggle for independence in the Basque area. And disappointingly, there was no great interest in those in Aberdeen. Can't understand why. But if any of you want copies of those particular pamphlets, I'm certain that I've still got some floating around. But I also lived in rural Aberdeenshire, and one of the one of the things that you had to do in rural Aberdeenshire in order to relate to the world was to get things through the post. There was no such things as Zoom, obviously. And I was a subscriber to Houseman's Peace Packets, where they would send you the pamphlets of the day, the leaflets of conferences that you could never go to, of demonstrations that you could never go to. And I've been involved with Houseman's as a customer since ever, and for a period on the board. But the bulk of my time in working in bookshops has been in Nottingham. Mushroom Bookshop, where I worked from 79 to 95, a kind of life sentence really. And it was a very successful cooperatively run radical bookshop. When I left, it was turning over 400,000 a year. And that was in 95. So scale that up, you get a sense of it was a successful business. And one of the things that has always interested me is that that you're trying to be radical, but you also have to pay the landlord, you have to pay the fuel bills, you have to pay the staff, and you have to pay the staff properly. So at Five Leaves, where I work, we pay more than the living wage for the staff. That's the proper living wage, not the government's slim version. But to go back to history, I said about Nottingham. In 1826, there was a radical bookshop in Nottingham. Nobody knows its name, but it was owned by Susanna Wright, and its issue was free thought. Atheism was the big issue at the time. And Susanna, who was a working class woman, she was a lace worker. She was involved in the humanist movement of the time. She had to defend her shop, which was picketed by Christians. They picketed her for 4 weeks. And eventually, some of them she won over, and others just got tired out. But some broke into her shop one day, and she took out a pistol and threatened them. Now, this isn't the opportunity to talk about gun laws, but clearly in 1826, gun laws were a little different to what they are now, and Susanna took out a gun and threatened the people invading her bookshop. Once it all calmed down, she vanished from history. That everybody would love to know what happened to Susanna. We know where her 2 shops were, but we don't know what happened to her when things calmed down. She stopped writing for the Atheist Press. But the big round of book selling at the time and a bit later was on the streets through things like the Clarion Van. I suspect everybody in this room has read The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. It was the book that old Labour MPs would always say was the most influential book in their lives. And for some of them, that was almost certainly true. And for some of them, they'd perhaps even read it. But the Clarion Vans in Mugsborough and Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist sold books to people in quantity. In Tressel's book, it says that they sold very, very little, but actually the Clarion Vans sold an awful lot of material. And what did they sell? They sold pamphlets, they sold paperbacks, and it was done in quantity. So Merry England sold at that time 2 million copies. And whilst people always assume that it was Alan Lane who invented the paperback in 1934, the story about how Penguin was invented, well, here's Britain for the British, which meant something else at the time, from 1902 by Robert Blatchford. My copy was from 1905. It's a bit fragile. But these were the kind of books that were sold by the tens of thousands from Clarion Vans. And they were very lovingly produced, and they were produced for what you could call an aspirational working class community, because there's adverts for pianos in them, there's adverts for boots, and there's adverts for Rowntree's Elect Cocoa. So there's an advert from 1905 for Rowntree's Elect Cocoa. That if you were an aspiring working class person, you'd be reading this book and you would be buying a piano. There were other bookshops in Manchester. There was even a Jewish anarchist bookshop, but it was really the Communist Party of Great Britain who took bookshops, as we now know them, to the people. They had chains of shops, and they had shops in unlikely places like Cheltenham, King's Lynn. It wasn't just Northampton would be perhaps the nearest to you. There was not a bookshop in Wellingborough, sorry. But they took books to the masses, and sometimes they were fairly straightforward bookshops, and other times they would be supplying the lit table for the branches, because no Communist Party meeting would be complete unless there was a lit table, and you would be encouraged to buy the latest pamphlet, the latest calendar of Stalin, and other things which haven't necessarily lasted the time politically. Nancy Mitford made a great play of these sort of bookshops, taking the complete piss out of them. But for a lot of people, that was their introduction to left-wing politics, through the lit table, through the bookshop, through the local headquarters. There were also book barrows, where people would sell books on the street through barrows. In our own shop, we've got a lovely picture of people selling books from those barrows. It's a kind of forgotten trade because there was no institutions, and the money was always cash in hand. There weren't proper businesses, but people survived. So the Communist Party bookshops kept going, not quite really, until the Communist Party itself folded in 91. There was one or two bookshops that had survived, but really it drifted away. What remained, though, was Central Books, who were the distributor for the Communist Party and Lawrence and Wishart. That sustained until today. Of the bookshops, Collett's was the jewel in the crown. They were an importer of material from China. They had a Chinese shop in London. They had a Russian shop in London. They had a back room on Charing Cross Road where you get the most obscure titles possible. But again, it didn't last. But the Communist Party had an interesting approach to literature. This is the Communist Bookshop catalogue. This was earlier than Collett's, where the Communist Bookshop was open daily, and all who need literature and periodicals of any description are invited to call. The stock is arranged on the open access plan, every facility being given for customers to examine books before purchase. That's rather nice, don't you think? They were the agents for Charles Kerr from the States. They were agents for the French Communist Party. They had extensive stocks of French and American books. And the prices are the most favorable possible because even communists like a bargain. But what was the general politics of the party at the time, and who were they representing? There was a magazine called The Eye, edited by Martin Lawrence, as in Lawrence and Wishart. And here's a front cover of it. It was all about literature. I don't know if you can see that from here. 3 men who changed your life. So, who were those 3 men?
Marx, Engels, Lenin.
Correct. And everything you do, every obstacle you meet and overcome, every pleasure you enjoy, every moment of indignation you feel, all these are not what you would have experienced had these men not lived to stamp themselves forever on the history of the human race. Make no mistake about it. I am not sure if every pleasure I've had personally should give thanks to Marx, Lenin, and Engels. There may have been other people involved in those pleasures. But politically, there were problems about writing about that era. So on the same page, I don't know if you can see it.
Could you hold it up a bit more?
We
Higher?
Soviet writers.
Yeah. Karl Radek, yeah.
Karl Radek died in the purges. So a lot of the material that the Communist Party was producing from the Soviet Union, it was dated in the most awkward fashion possible when some of the writers would disappear. But Collett's, not only did they have a chain of shops, not only did they have a library supply business, but they had kind of a motorized version of a bookshop where they would wander around Manchester, Glasgow, and London with these. They weren't book barrows; they were book barrows on wheels, I suppose. And they got into trouble from time to time. And but the aim of them was to take books to the masses, and to a certain extent, to a great extent, they actually succeeded. Moving on, there were other people coming in. The Communist Party was fading away, and in the 60s, there were other tendencies coming forward. The counterculture, a lot of it coming in from America, poetry from City Lights, from New Directions. There were bookshops like Better Books in Edinburgh, Indica, Ultima Thule in Newcastle, Compendium, who would be selling psychedelia, Henry Miller, hippie material, psychology, books by R.D. Laing. This was when I was beginning to come to book buying as a conscious adult, trying to buy this sort of material. Well, in Aberdeen, there wasn't actually any of these counterculture bookshops, but there was a pornographic bookshop with the wonderful name of Willie's. And they sold Henry Miller, they sold psychedelia, they sold R.D. Laing. You had to kind of look to see who was in the area before going in, because it would be rather embarrassing for a young lefty to be seen going into a pornographic bookshop, not least because it was actually run by a Liberal Democrat councillor called Willie. But that's where I started to buy this counterculture kind of material. That kind of died away thanks to feminism. That feminist ideas started to come, of course, from America. And I'm not disregarding the working class feminism that there'd been in Britain. I'm not disregarding the radical suffragettes. But the feminist movement that we know was starting to come in, and people were setting up cooperatively run bookshops. There were so many of them. And they were kind of looked down a bit on by the trade. So the Radical Bookseller, a magazine that we had a piece which they were actually reprinting from the weekly trade paper, The Bookseller. And it was a good pastiche, 2nd of August, 1980. Our representative will be calling on all left-wing fringe and mystic politico book outlets for promotion to workshops, primal therapy groups, and whatever. All books will be supplied sale or return, as pretty well all these accounts are on stop, and the only way I can get round credit control. Most copies will either be returned thumbed, torn, marked, and underlined beyond recognition, or sold, never paid for. This last will be seen as a political act against unscrupulous publishing giants. So the straight trade took the piss out of us, and actually we took the piss out of ourselves. Here's Alexei Sale talking about a Maoist bookshop in London called the Bellman Bookshop, which was the Communist Party of Britain Marxist-Leninist. The Bellman Bookshop was a dark and forbidding former bank on Fortress Road in Tufnell Park, northwest London, a depressive Irish neighbourhood of gloomy pubs, grey rooming houses, and cash butchers. A lot of people don't know what cash butchers are, but I'm certain you all know what a cash butcher are. There were at least 2 other Maoist bookshops in the area owned by competing sects. One was nearly as big as Woolworths. These other places had proper Marxist-Leninist names, such as the London Workers' Bookshop. But bizarrely, the Bellman was named after a character in Lewis Carroll's nonsense poems, The Hunting of the Snark. The party bookshop was overseen by Reg Wife. Reg was the leader of the CPB-ML. She was called the Reg Birch. She was called Dorothy, the daughter of a vicar who looked like the daughter of a vicar. She constantly smoked and would tap the ash from her fag into the pockets of her long grey cardigan that she inevitably wore. Occasionally she would begin smouldering, wisps of grey smoke curling from her hips. Comrades were frequently too frightened of Dorothy to tell her she was on fire. She was the only person who knew the stock, but it was so dreary that anybody browsing was bound to be a member of the special branch or a rival group. So we could take the piss out of ourselves, but actually there were over 100 similar bookshops to the one I worked in, Mushroom Bookshop in Nottingham. The minority of the bookshops were party bookshops from the small sects, I suppose. The bulk of them, which appeared in many towns, Northampton again was perhaps the nearest to you, were cooperatively run and in some cases very successful businesses. Eventually, they went into a decline as well. The net book agreement was brought in, was abolished by the government. The net book agreement was where all books had to be sold at the same price. So the net book agreement was abolished, so Waterson's would be selling 3 for 2, not realizing that along later would come Amazon, not realizing that along later would come supermarkets selling books at half price. But all of that meant the number of independent bookshops went into decline. And Jackie Kay, who some of you will know, wrote a wonderful poem called Silver Moon, which was the name of a feminist bookshop on Charing Cross Road. So, Jackie Kay. Your names, old records, Court and Spark, Dark Side of the Moon, a shop window welcome, open hands, new friends, a winter evening, nights drawing in, warm glow, Sister Right, Feminist Bookshop London, Compendium, Alternative Bookshop London, Silver Moon. How you grew up reading Nights to Dawn, books you only found there, the then unknowns, Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni, Tony Cade Bambara. The bluest eye held up its haunting mirror, Piccola Breadleaf. Switch lights on, eyes wide open. Sula, Corregidora, you read and read with wonder. We are everywhere, writing about lesbian parents, voices from women's liberation, Maya, Juna, Zora. And by the silvery light of the bookshop, you grew up by the open door, standing alone together, other readers as engrossed as you. Of independent bookshops, remember things. Look how you love their names, Voltaire and Rousseau. Grassroots, books gathering, haunting your years, black and white striped spines, tiny irons, Viragos, Shebas, the bell jar, your brain's word power. Don't let them turn the lights out, dears. Keep them safe. New beacons, shining stars. Look how you've aged with your beloved books, dear hearts. Keep coming in. Keep the bookshop door ajar. Around the time I was involved in producing a book called Starting a Bookshop, and we had beautiful logos of many of the bookshops there or hinted at there on the front cover. And the one chapter that we didn't include was how to close down a bookshop. It never occurred to us that so many of us would go, but go they did. But some of that was self-inflicted, that some of us were to write on for our own good, that customers felt disapproved of unless they were along our lines. Some of us were thought that actually paying people proper wages was a reactionary thing to do, that people should work in these sort of bookshops for love, which meant if you had children, if you were of working class background, how could you work in these bookshops? There was a lot that was open to criticism. But there were a lot of other issues that we had to face, like fascists. All of us, all of the radical bookshops had problems with fascists. Fourth Idea in Bradford, whenever Bradford City played at home, every second Saturday, they would have fascists coming in the shop. Bookshops got letter bombs. Mushroom Bookshop, where I worked in '94, got invaded by 50 fascists. 32 were arrested, 13 eventually went to jail. I could never quite warm to fascists myself, but it was difficult to concentrate on running a bookshop if every third phone call was a death threat. And I'm not exaggerating. At periods there were. You'd get people ringing up, playing German martial music down the phone to you, shouting, "Red scum, get out of Nottingham or die." And our locks would be glued up, arson attempts on the shop. We had to deal on a day-to-day basis with fascists, but we also had to deal on a day-to-day basis with state censorship, particularly over selling An Phoblacht, the paper of Sinn Féin, selling anything of interesting nature in Ireland. We got a letter once from part of the Home Office saying we were selling a particular book about the secret state that was related to Ireland. Could we take it off sale? And if it wasn't taken off sale, we would be prosecuted. We didn't even know we had that book. We had to search for it and blow the dust off it. Nobody was actually interested in that book, but the secret state knew that we had it. LGBT books were seized, particularly at Gaze the Word in London. And in Nottingham, we faced other issues as Islamists, for example, over selling Salman Rushdie and satanic
Satanic
verses.
verses.
Yeah, we had posters in the window saying "Fight Racism, not Rushdie," and there was a we sold it openly, put masses of copies in the window, and a friend of mine, you can tell by the name, Muhammad Aslam, he was a
I
Muslim
know.
local leader,
Mm.
and Aslam, his counsellor, he rang me up and said, "Ross, I've got a bit of a problem with you selling this book. You know that I disapprove of it very much." I said, "Have you read it, Aslam?" And he said, "No, but I know the content of it. Many of my friends have read it." I said, "Why are you ringing me?" And he said, "What I want to tell you is we've organized a demonstration about this book, and we think you should know. We've organized this demonstration, can't remember exactly where, but it was like miles away from Mushroom Bookshop." He said, "The youth are really, really angry about that. So what we're doing is we're taking them about 2 miles from anywhere else and giving them a demonstration so that they can let off steam." Um, uh, he wouldn't publicly say he supported us. He couldn't because he was a community leader. But the number of Labour councillors, Muslim Labour councillors, who I'd go around their houses and there would be a copy of Satanic Verses on their shelves that they bought from us. It was a really interesting issue. Politically, it was difficult at times. We lost the miners' strike, and that had a devastating effect on the body politic, and people were very disillusioned. And I think that helped the long decline of radical bookshops of that era. But then they started to come back. We rose, as always happens in politics. You go into a decline, there's reasons, you come out of it, and there's also reasons. And since then, the number of radical bookshops has been rising. We have an organization, the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. We have a book prize, the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. We did have, until COVID, a London Radical Book Fair, and we keep planning to bring it back, but never do. We have a Little Rebels Award for Radical Children's Publishing. We have a magazine for Radical Bookshops history. We do a lot of the heavy lifting still, as Radical Bookshops have always done, particularly over trans rights, particularly over neurodiversity. A lot of the places that started stocking trans books, started discussing neurodiversity, were Radical Bookshops. The nature of the owners has changed as well. Whereas the previous generation was very much collectives, nowadays it tends to be, I use the American phrase, activist entrepreneurs. I own Five Leaves Bookshop. I employ workers, and hopefully I'm a decent employer. Ask my workers that, publicly or privately, up to you. But increasingly, it's hard to be a cooperative. It's hard to actually find the capital to open a bookshop. So the current wave of bookshops tends to be activist entrepreneurs, though I find it hard to think of myself as an entrepreneur. But if you came into our bookshop, and Paul was in the bookshop last week, some of you may have been in our bookshop, how radical are we? If you go into pages of Hackney, for example, you'll find a lot of the books that we stock, and they're an entirely commercial bookshop. If you go into quite a lot of independent bookshops, you'll find gay books. You'll find books on left-wing politics. And ultimately, I think there's only one difference between a radical bookshop and a good independent bookshop, and that's in the back office or the back cupboard, the storeroom, the toilet. In one of those places, there'll be a bunch of placards, and they will all have a note on saying, I'll collect them on Monday, Mary. Nobody knows which Monday Mary means, and nobody even knows who Mary is, but there will be a group of placards. And that's what defines a radical bookshop in my mind. The people who will happily have these really annoying Marys of this world never coming back for her placards as they go out of date, as they get tatty, as you have to move them to get to the back end of the stockroom. We still have problems with fascists, but that can be quite entertaining. There was Mushroom Bookshop, Five Leaves Bookshop. UKIP organised a few years ago a boycott Five Leaves Bookshop campaign. And their Facebook site was hilarious because people were saying on it, well, I've never heard of Five Leaves Bookshop and I'm certainly never going into it. Well, to be boycotted by somebody who was already boycotting you is probably pretty ideal. But there was somebody who understood algorithms better than us. So their campaign was boycott Five Leaves Bookshop. And this guy set up a Facebook site saying boycott Five Leaves Bookshop and progressive rock. And he filled his site full of tirades against progressive rock, completely deranged tirades against this musical form that he hated. So if you were to look up boycott Five Leaves, the site that you would find was this utterly deranged site about progressive rock. And it was so funny at the time. But there's always still the risk. Year before last, somebody went to prison for 4.5 years for preparing to commit an act of terror, which was preparing to burn down our bookshop. He is a Nazi, or he may have changed his mind while serving his time in prison. His particular thing was over Black Lives Matters, that we'd supported black causes throughout. And the police came to us a rather strange occasion. They said, we'd like to meet you privately. We met around this table that I'm currently on, and they said, we've just arrested somebody for preparing to commit an act of terror against your bookshop. Can we talk about it? And that was really interesting. And it gets more interesting as time goes on, because of course, people are being arrested under the Terrorism Act for saying that they're against genocide and support Palestine action. And I think that there's always been a certain degree of ambivalent relationship between radical bookshops and the state and the police. But there can be some very nice lines on that. When Mushroom Bookshop was raided by the fascists in 1994, the person who got the longest sentence was somebody whose fingerprints was on the underside of shelves. He couldn't say he was there, but he did nothing. His fingerprints were all over there. And about a year ago, an irregular customer said to me, the shop was empty. He said one of the proudest days of his life was finding the fingerprints under those shelves, because he knew he could send a fascist to prison for that. So, discuss. What else do I want to talk about? I didn't really say about what sort of books we sold in the 80s, but given the age of, I think all of you there, you were alive and kicking.
Except Sue. I think Sue's the youngest here. I don't know how old Ruth is, but
oh well, you may not be their age, but you're hanging around with that older crowd. But just I thought it might be useful to say what we sold in the 80s. And this is Newcastle, a bookshop called Days of Hope. And their bestsellers in February 1981 were Protest and Survive, which was the people's answer to the government's Protect and Survive. Number 2, Arguments for Socialism, Tony Benn. Spare Rib Diary, feminist diary. Women on the Edge of Time, utopian fiction by the feminist Marge Piercy. Marx for Beginners. England is a Bitch, which is a pamphlet by Lyndon Kwesi Johnson. Towards a Citizen's Militia, which was a pamphlet produced from Orkney, strangely enough, about how to create a citizen's militia. And Radical Bookshop sold any amount of copies to territorial army types rather than the left. Number 8, Revolt Against the Age of Plenty, which was a local publication of working class history. 9, Hiroshima by John Hershey. 10, a book on state intervention in industry. So that's what was being sold by Days of Hope in Edinburgh, in Newcastle, which everybody called a haze of dope. There were 2 people who went on to become Labour cabinet ministers who worked there. I'm never quite sure whether, I think you can probably work out when you know who they are, whether it was more appropriate to call the bookshop Days of Hope or Haze of Dope. Somebody's ruined it by saying who it was. I'm not sure who put that, but who were these 2 people? Somebody just did on the chat.
That's Ruth, I think.
No, it was before that. Somebody put down Alan Milburn.
So yeah, that was Ruth.
Yeah, so the 2 people who went on to become Labour cabinet ministers from Days of Hope were Alan Milburn, and I like to think that the other would be more appropriate to the term haze of dope. It was Mo Molan. So 200 years of Radical Bookshop's history, what have we achieved? We've created 2 cabinet ministers. We've created peace in Ireland, thanks to Mo Molan. We've sold a lot of books, and admittedly, some of them were Stalin calendars. We've made a lot of people happy. We've provided a source of attraction to fascists. And we've kept me for having a proper job for most of my life. And that, at least, I have Radical Bookshops to be thankful for. I'm very happy to take questions for the remaining 15 minutes before the break.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was brilliant, very, very enjoyable, and what a wonderful potted history of the Radical Bookshop movement. Excellent, thank you very much. Has anyone got everyone can unmute now. I muted everybody during the talk because sometimes you get a background noise. But Tony, you want to come in?
Yeah, Wilkie told me that 5 Leaves was a Rizla reference. Is that right?
Well, yes, this is awfully embarrassing because I worked in a bookshop called Mushroom Bookshop, and that was, I wouldn't have chosen that name for Mushroom, but it was there when I arrived. And when the bookshop opened, there was certainly Mushroom Bookshop came out of the drugs counterculture, and indeed mushrooms were relevant there. So the last thing I wanted when I started 5 Leaves in '95, initially as a publisher and then as a bookshop, was to have a drugs reference. But the album I liked best was by Nick Drake, called 5 Leaves Left.
Right.
And I had no idea what that meant, but I loved that album. And just looking around for a name for what was then a publishing firm, later the bookshop, I thought, well, 5 Leaves has got a nice kind of ring to it. It's a bit literary. No, it's not very clear what it is, but people will remember it. And so we started as 5 Leaves. And then somebody said, that's 5 Leaves Left, isn't it? Yes, it's from 5 Leaves Left. Do you know the origin of 5 Leaves Left? And I said, I haven't the faintest idea. And it was in Rizla packets. They used to, they may still do for all I know. On the 6th last leaf, as you took it out, it would say 5 Leaves Left, which was traditionally the number of leaves of a Rizla packet that you used to roll a joint with. I've mentioned this on a number of occasions. There's always people ask, and then it leads to argument about the exact number of leaves of a Risla that you should use to roll a joint with. But I sometimes wish that name had ever been chosen. We did quite a lot of publishing of Jewish secular culture, and one of the books that we published was called Jews and Sex. And when it was reviewed in the Jewish Chronicle, the publisher was given as Fig Leaves Press, which I thought was appropriate for a book on Jews and sex, the fig leaves. But yes, there were. I think a lot of the names are actually very beautiful. The one that I liked most of all was Lavender Menace, which was a lesbian and gay bookshop in Edinburgh, Lavender Menace. And the veterans of that have reformed as a kind of archive group for what's now the LGBT movement in Scotland. But Lavender Menace, I thought, was absolutely terrific.
Very good.
It had a predecessor called West and Wild from Rebecca West and Oscar Wilde. And they'd get people, publishers' reps, coming round and saying, "Is Mr. Wilde or Ms. Weston at the moment?" Sadly, Oscar wasn't returning calls.
Okay. Stan, you've unmuted. Did you want to say anything? I've noticed.
No.
You just unmuted.
No, just to say, I mean, I've been to Five Leaves quite a few times. I always stop off there on the way round to down to Northampton to see the family. But it's a wonderful looking up that little alleyway. The mural, the pictures on the alleyway, wonderful. Going through the door, and it feels like coming home. There's one time it wasn't yourself, but one of your colleagues said, "Oh, sit down on the floor if you haven't looked through some books." So I had the books on the floor with me, looking through them all. Wonderful. I have to say it's small and perfectly formed, because you go in there and seriously, so much over there. I mean, I always go to the Irish section, and I could stay there half the day. I have to be honest with you, I did stay quite a bit of time there on Thursday, going through all the Irish books, deciding which. I always make a point of buying one book at least, or a pamphlet, because I think it's important to support radical bookshops. I have to say, great wee selection of leaflets and pamphlets. You got them down at the end before your office, I think, and you got them around near the counter and all. It's great. Do like the wee notice board you got, because I think that's important. To flag up stuff that's going on in the local area that you would normally not hear about. So good to see Radical Bookshops. Good to see the one in Nottingham.
Thank you. And our Irish section's small, but our Irish custom is actually huge. And we have a monthly Irish book group. And today we were planning some events for St. Patrick's Day. We'll have something on the All-Irish League, a talk on the All-Irish League. We'll have an evening of Irish poetry. We try to do something each year for St. Pat's. And we're also planning to do 4 talks over the year on the Irish rhythms of the year from St. Bridget's Day onwards.
Just passed.
So which is just passed. So we'll start around May Day, but the plan is to do 4 there. We have one worker who's very part-time, who's runs the Irish Book Group, which is really successful, a literature group. And in the past, me and her separately, we did 3 days called Changing Ireland, where we had about 150 people on these day events, and we brought Danny Morrison across from the north, and somebody had written a book on the navvies, to talk about the navvies. We put up Danny Morrison in the Westminster Hotel in Nottingham because we thought that was a good joke. Since his aim in life was to blow up Westminster, but he became a novelist in due course. He moved from a life of crime to another life of crime by being a novelist. Yes, we have a long-term interest in Irish.
Could I ask, do you offer a coffee bar? So I've always thought that bookshops and coffee bars go well together. That people can then pick up a book and read it.
No, we
But
we don't. In fact, very few radical bookshops do. That the general advice that the independents have said is that you start off with a bookshop and a coffee bar, and you end up with a coffee bar and a bookshop. That all of your troubles are to do with the coffee bars. All of the awkward health and safety things that you have to do are to do with that. All of your supply problems, and everybody I know who runs a coffee bar on top of a bookshop finds that the coffee bars are a real headache. We would if we had space, but probably. Paul's been in the shop; he knows there's not room. But if we ever got to the stage where we had enough room, we would want to have a coffee bar, but run by somebody else. I don't think I'd be a very good barista. So,
just as a quick one, I forgot I had a book which you might like. It's Motherfucker.
Motherfucker.
In a roundabout way, it means library.
Dispatches from a dead what? Language. Language.
No, there's dispatches from not so dead language.
Not so dead language. Oh, yeah.
Up north, roughly translated, you might be Mother Library or something like that. Library. Yeah. But yeah.
I'll look out for that.
Yeah.
I didn't mention another bookshop in Nottingham called, well, actually, it was just called the Bookshop, and it was in the front of the business. It sold secondhand books, which you could take back. This was in the 1960s. You could take back and get money back for them, and you buy others. They sold comics, but in the upstairs was the international headquarters of the group that became the International Marxist Group, which started in Nottingham. And we did a book, a memoir of it called Winter at the Bookshop, which was about being poor, about being working class, about being heavily political in Nottingham in the 1960s. And I mean, it's a really interesting period book. The IMG was set up in Nottingham initially as the international group, Ken Coates, Pat Jordan. But there was a group of people who lived in the building who served in the shop. But the shop was a front, and you went in the back and you went upstairs, and there were duplicators, there were posters of Ben Bella, there were FLN, NLF flags from Algeria and from Vietnam. And but the best part of it being there, bearing in mind this was the early 60s, was there was a wedding ring on the mantelpiece where the women who wanted to go away to stay in a hotel for the weekend with their boyfriend would borrow the wedding ring, because you couldn't stay in a hotel with your boyfriend unless you were married. So you would borrow the wedding ring and pretend to be married. So there was a number of people who did so borrow, and two of them ended up in a lifelong relationship on the basis of the borrowed wedding ring. But unfortunately, we've not been able to trace it, because in the Radical Bookshop Museum of the Future, I would really love to have that wedding ring as a piece. That it was enabled sexual congress to happen amongst those who would have otherwise found it difficult. Radical bookshops have a lot to blame for, I think, and that was one of the wee things about them. But
could I just ask you a question about bookshops within the Black community? Because I read today that I mean, you'll know him, Eric Huntley. Died. I think it was today or yesterday. And I knew Eric because I lived in West London, and he had a shop in Hanwell. But there's a strong tradition within the Black community as well of bookshops as well. And I just wondered if you could say something about the history of those, if you know about it, and how they sprung up, and your relationship within the network. Did they participate in the radical book movement at that time?
Yes and no, but primarily they had their own lives. They didn't take part in the Federation of Alternative Booksellers and its successor organisation, Federation of Radical Booksellers. We had friendly relationships with them, but they didn't get involved with us. And there's one bookshop that has survived from those early days. Excuse me, New Beacon,
Yes.
set up by John La Rose, who was a West Indian trade unionist, and that is now run by his son, and it's coming up its 60th anniversary. I think they're having its 60th anniversary this year. The only other black bookshop that's current in Britain is in Brixton, and its name escapes me just for the moment. They're about to move to much bigger premises because it's been so successful. But there was certainly a period in the late 70s, 80s, where there were a number of black bookshops around Britain. There was one in Leicester. There was one in Nottingham called Du Jama, and there were several in London. And there were very kind of key people like Eric Huntley involved in that. And at one of our London Radical Book Fairs, we had a session where we brought together a bunch of old timers like Eric, he was one of them, to do a talk on Black British bookselling. And I was chairing the next session in that hall, and they didn't come out. I hadn't been around to see people go in, but they weren't coming out. And eventually time was moving on, and you kind of had to open the door and say, could you come out? And I opened the door, and there were waves of heat poured out because so many people had turned up to see this bunch of veterans of Black British publishing and bookselling. Most of those who turned up were young Black people. But this room was way beyond any conceivable fire limit. And they had to be forced out because they didn't want to leave these heroes that they'd had. And so,
where's New Beacon Books?
It's in the same place it's always been. Can't quite remember, but it's never moved. The other big bookshop, it did a lot of publishing as well, because a lot of the black bookshops did publishing, like Bogle Louverture. I have been to New Beacon in the past, but I can't quite remember. It's
not to worry. Don't worry.
I think it's Deptford. It's in an area that was
South London.
South London that's been beginning to get gentrified.
Yeah. Anybody else questions? Tony, come back. You need to unmute.
Yeah, when we spoke, Ross, you were reluctant to identify any people that we might support through our donation, in recognition, and thank you very much for giving your talk. But I got a suggestion in that Stan and I have had quite a lot of involvement with an activist in Wisbech who is a trade union activist and who writes very good booklets on a range of radical subjects, and her name is Sue Doherty. I think Stan will probably
Sue Dockett. You went to her stall last time.
Oh yeah, she does books on pamphlets on important women in the trade union movement. And she did a book with the TUC about women trade unionists, which she kindly gave me, or I did give her a donation, but she was giving it to me, which I gave to the Nottingham Women's History Group in Nottingham, who were very pleased to get it. I thought her stall, her pamphlets were ones that would be hard to sell in a bookshop, but at a book fair, where she's there and where you see the range properly displayed.
I just wonder whether you, in particular, there being a local person, regional to us and Peterborough and so on, and it is an important thing supporting, as you do, publishing, publishing is part of what you do, and she both writes and publishes. I just wonder whether you'd be happy for us to
very much
make
so.
a donation to her, please.
Very much so. Because what I didn't talk about, and one could talk for hours, and is about book fairs. And book fairs which are a combination of professional booksellers and people like her and people like you selling secondhand books. They're fantastic. And I was going to give a tiny reading about the now deceased anarchist book fair, but
is it another Alexei Sale reading?
No.
Oh, shucks.
But I would be very happy if you insist on there being a donation going to her. But can I just end with something about an anarchist book fair? Can I do that?
Of course you can.
So the anarchist book fair was actually maybe about 3,000 people would go. It had a very long life, an astonishingly long life, and then it fell apart over trans rights. It's come back to life now, but this is from the past when it was very successful. And it was an article by D.D. Johnson called Peace, Love and Petrol Bombs. So this is how the anarchist book fair goes. At midday, you want to celebrate the libertarian tradition in all its diversity. After half an hour, you remember that anarcho-primitivists are mental. At 1 o'clock, you tell your mate, if it's not class struggle, it can fuck off and play in the traffic. At 3 o'clock, you remember that the situationists are annoying. Autonomous Marxists are boring, and platformists are Trotskyists in disguise. By 5 o'clock, it's only your old mates, Dave and Jim, who are even worth talking to. And at 7 o'clock, you remember that Jim sprays everything after he's had a few, and Dean has an annoying habit of quoting Malatesta. Fuck the lot of them.
That sounds like a real fun place to go to, actually.
I used to go there every year, and all of those people would be there.
Yeah. Well, I think we've come to...
Sorry, I was going to say, as a total aside, when I arrived in England in 79, one of the first places I went to or tried to go to, because they weren't always open, Freedom Bookshop.
Yeah, it's still going in Angel Alley. But there was also an Irish book shop called Green Ink.
Yes, Green Ink, yes.
And it was very successful. I think it might have been the Connolly, associated with the Connolly Association.
Yeah, it was.
Well, Ross, thank you very much for that. We're going to take a short break. I don't know if we want to finish your part of the meeting now, or whether you're happy to stay for a little bit longer after the break, in case over the break people may think of other things they'd like to ask you. But we'll definitely finish your section by 8:30 latest. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
You're happy to stay to 8:30, and so we'll come back in. It's 6 minutes past. So should we say 8:15?
Okay.
We'll come back 8:15. People can stay and chat if you like. You can unmute and stay and chat. You don't have to go away. You don't have to have a break if you don't want. You can stay and chat. It's a bit like a break.
Yeah, I'm going for a comfort break.
Yeah, that's fine. But others can stay if they want.
Yeah, you can't see me, but I'm going as well.